Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am Harry Lauseneziris, and this is my YouTube channel grecochess. And in this video, we are concluding the coverage of the New York State Chess Championship that took place about a couple of weeks ago in Albany, New York. This is round number 6, but first, let's give a look at the announcement of the tournament. As you see here, this is the 147th annual New York State Championship. According to the organizers, this is the oldest chess championship in the entire world that is still going on. It was divided in various sections, depending on the skills of the players. The champion would emerge from the championship section, but in order to participate there, you needed a rating of at least 1900. And with my rating being 1582, I was only 318 points short of that limit. If you could not play there, the other options were under 2100, under 1800, that's where I participated, and there were even two lower sections, under 1500 and under 1200. 6 rounds, as you see here, and the time control is what you'll see here. What does this expression mean? It means that you must complete your first 40 moves in 80 minutes, otherwise you lose a lot of time. And if you do so and the game is still going on, you are going to get an extra 30 minutes to the time, of course, that you have kept from the previous part. And you must complete now all your moves in this time that you still have. But each time it's your turn to move, there is a D30, delay of 30 seconds, which means that for the first 30 seconds of your move, once the opponent has completed their move and it's your turn to play, the clock does not move. So if you complete your move in less than 30 seconds, you don't lose any time. Otherwise, to whatever time you needed, subtract 30 seconds and you lose whatever is the difference. As you may remember, if you have seen the previous videos, after the first 5 rounds, I had wins in round number 1, 3, 5, losses in rounds numbers 2 and 4, which meant I had 3 out of 5. This meant that I was nowhere near the bottom. Most likely I was at least in the middle, with a chance to be above the middle, but very little chance to be at the top. 3 out of 5, and now round number 6. But let's first see who was my opponent. My opponent was Justin Scott Rosales, whose rating, as you see here, is 1643. That is before the tournament, of course. He was in the 88th percentile, and also he belongs to the second category. What do categories mean? Depending on your past performance, you gain various, as they call, norms, and if you get enough norms, you jump from each category to the higher one. Let's compare this with my numbers. Before the tournament, my rating was 1582, 86th percentile, and third category. This meant that clearly Justin was the favorite. And we're going now to the chessboard of chess.com to see what actually happened. I'm going to enter the moves one after the other. And the computer is going to show, you're going to see first of all in the left half of the screen, what is the position after every move. And on the right half below the word analysis, you're going to see the computer evaluation. Positive number means white is better. Negative number means that black is better. The computer will show if the move played was the best or not, and if not, which would have been the best move, and also what are the best 3 options for the player whose turn is to come. And we're starting. Justin has the white pieces and I have the black. Justin starts with the pawn going to e4, and I reply with the French defense, pawn goes to e6. Second move, standard for the French, pawn goes to d4, and I move my pawn to d5. For the French defense, these are the standard first 2 moves. And the question is, what is white going to do in the third move? They have at least four choices for the most popular. The advanced pawn goes to e5, the knight may go to c3 or d2, or the bishop to d3. And Justin decides to send his knight to d2. Now, this particular French defense is called the Taras variation after a player, Dr. Sigbert Taras, who promoted him. How to reply? My pawn goes from c7 to c5. And Justin takes my pawn to d5. I take it back. And the more moves we play, the more the opening, the longer the name of the opening. Now it becomes the French defense Taras open delayed exchange variation. This is after the first four moves. Fifth move, Justin develops his knight to f3, and I develop my knight f6. And sixth move, check with the bishop and b5. How do you reply? I don't want to have my knight pinned, so I move my bishop to d7, basically posing the question to Justin, does he want to exchange bishops? Does he want to move the bishop to another diagonal, or does he want to protect it some other way? And he decides to protect it some other way, and his way was queen goes to e2, check. And I answer the check with my bishop to e7. We completed seven moves. We are still in what's called the book, meaning in the opening theory. My problem, of course, at that time, I didn't know that we're still in the book, although I had half guessed it. My problem is that both of my bishops are out of play because of the pins. And it's Justin's turn to play. How will he continue? He decides to castle, which is good, but not the best for the computer. Now we are out of theory. What would have been the best if he took the pawn on c5? Because of the pin on my bishop, I cannot take it back, and I'm back one pawn. I'm down one pawn. Still, since two pawns are doubled and the one is out of center, the advantage is not so big as it would have been, but still they would have been an advantage for white. How to reply? Castle for me, and now both of my bishops are back in the game. None is pinned any longer. Now Justin takes the pawn, but now he cannot keep it because my bishop is not pinned any longer. Now it goes to b3 to attack my bishop, and my bishop goes back to b6. As I have mentioned in the past, when you attack an opponent's piece, most of the times it's not because you expect your opponent to miss it and lose the piece, but it's because while the opponent is dealing with this threat, they cannot move ahead with any other attacking ideas they may have. And you place a constraint on them, meaning their piece cannot go to some particular squares and have to choose among the remaining ones. Bishop goes to g5, and my knight is pinned. My bishop takes the bishop on b5. Queen takes the bishop on b5. And I want now to break the pin. How to break it? My queen goes to d6, which the computer says a mistake. Of course, at that game, I didn't see it. The computer analysis showed that ideally Justin should have taken my knight. I take it back, and then I'm losing the pawn at d5, a nice central pawn. That is why my move was a mistake. But I got lucky because Justin wanted to strengthen the center, moved his pawn to c3. Not a bad idea, but when your alternative is to win a nice central pawn, that is not the best way. I finally deal with the issue. My knight goes to d7, so if Justin takes my knight on f6, then the knight on d7 will take it back, and I'm not losing the pawn. As you may see, my pawn on d5 is what is called isolated, meaning there are no pawns on the c and e files protecting it or at least with a chance to protect it, which means that if it's attacked, it must be defended by pieces. This is usually a weakness, but it might be compensated by other factors. It becomes bigger weakness when we are near the end, when there are very much fewer pieces to defend it. Justin sends his knight to d4, and I attack the queen. Queen goes to b3, and as you may see, my bishop on b6 is defending both my knight on d7 and the queen on d6. But if my bishop moves, I'm going to lose the b7 pawn. I need to be careful with that, because if for any reason my bishop is attacked, let's assume that the pawn goes to a5, just to give an example, and the bishop moves, then I'm going to lose the pawn at b7. How to reply? Threaten the bishop on g5 by moving my pawn from h7 to h6. So Justin needs to think what to do with the bishop. Exchange it, send it back, and if back where? Justin sends it to g4 to h4, and now I'm taking the knight. Knight crosses the computer. Of course, now white cannot take my pawn on b7. First, I need to recapture my bishop. And to do so without creating an isolated pawn, they do it using the knight. If they took the pawn, then they also have the d pawn, the isolated d pawn. Now I have to deal with the pawn at b7. It's going to get lost. I push it to b5. And Justin sends his pawn to a4 and threatens my pawn on b5. And I decide, instead of saving it, as I say, danger level, to create an attack. What is attack? I send my knight on e4. Since the knight is not pinned any longer, I don't have to worry about moving the knight. The threat is the following. If Justin does something irrelevant, for example, if he wants to win the pawn on b5, my knight goes to d2 and threatens, and has a fox, threatens both the queen on b3 and the rook on f1, and they win at least an exchange. An exchange for a pawn is a very nice deal. But no luck for me. Justin sees this threat, and doesn't take my pawn, and sends his queen on c2. There is no fork any longer. If I send my knight to d2, the queen would just take it directly. I have to deal with my threat of my pawn on b5, so how do I do it? I take the pawn on a4. And Justin could easily take it back, whether with the queen or with the rook, but he decides to play what's called a Zwischenzug. It's a German word that means the move in between. He's going to threaten my knight, and the idea being that I have to relocate my knight. Doesn't have too many squares to go, and has to go back. In fact, you want to send the knights back. You don't want them to be in your half of the board. And while I take it back, then next move he can take the pawn, but there's a little problem. I send my knight to c5. And by sending it to c5, I protect the pawn at a4. Justin can take it neither with the queen or the rook. He's going to lose at least in exchange for a pawn if he does it. And that is why I stay with the pawn, with an extra pawn. Is it enough? The computer says that still white is better, 0.82. The pawns are doubled. They're on the edge of the board. But not a bad idea. Not a bad deal, I would say. So white sends the knight to f5 and threatens my queen, and could even threaten a check on e7 because it's protected by the bishop. My king cannot go to h7, can only go to h8, and I really need to be careful. For the time being, I send my queen to b6 to save it. And not only that, after the pawn moves to f3, I'm almost giving a check, and it's only my knight on c5 that blocks and saves the white king. If white could do nothing or do something irrelevant, knight goes to b3, and there's a double attack. The check and also the rook at a1. Still, this doesn't necessarily win material because the bishop can cover the check. But Justin doesn't want to wait until then to cover. He puts now the bishop on f2, and my knight on c5 is pinned. I cannot move it, otherwise I'm going to lose my queen. I continue placing my rook on b8, and I threaten the pawn on b2. Attack twice, defend once. Justin sends his rook from f1 to b1 to protect it. Computer thinks that this is a mistake, and now I'm ahead by 0.12. Would rather have the rook go to e1, occupy the open file, meaning the positional advantage out of having this open file for the rook is more important than the pawn. I send my queen to b7 because I don't want to deal with the pin any longer. You can see that there's a possibility of the pin if the pawn goes b4. Of course, there is an en passant, but I'll have to be very, very careful. That's why my queen going to b7. I don't have to worry about my knight on c5, and it's protected by the knight on d7, so I don't have to worry about the bishop taking my knight. Bishop goes to g3 now, since there is no pin, and attacks my rook. My rook has to move and goes to d8 to add extra protection to my knight on d7. Rook goes to d1 to exert pressure on the pawn on d5. And my knight goes to f6 to add extra support for it. Computer doesn't like it, would rather have my knight go on f8. But I was thinking that this way I give two layers of protection to my pawn, both from the rook and from the knight. Keep in mind, my pawn on d5 is isolated. If it is lost, the c pawn becomes a passed pawn, and white has a good chance to win. All that white would need to do, not all that white, but one way to win would be to exchange everything and have this and this passed pawn on c go to promotion. We finished the first 25 moves, and let's see how things are going. Computer thinks that white has a small advantage of 0.96. This does not guarantee a win, but better be ahead by 0.96 than behind. Material, I have an extra pawn. Uh, Pawn structure, I have weaknesses, the double pawns on the A file and the isolated on D5. Let's see what's going to happen. We just finished the first 25 moves. Move 26. Bishop goes to h4 for Justin. First of all, he pins my knight because the rook is behind it. And if he exchanges it, even if the pawn takes it back, then the knight can take the h6 pawn. I lose a pawn, and my king is very, very much in the open. King safety is very important in chess, and you don't want the king to be exposed like that way. But how to reply? Because it's my turn to play. Queen goes to b6. Again, there is a threat for the check if the knight disappears. And if bishop takes knight, then queen takes bishop. And Justin decides to exchange. His bishop takes my knight. Mistakes is a computer, queen takes bishop. And you see here that from Justin having a small advantage, now I'm ahead by 0.74. There were many potential threats, not threats yet, but potential threats that the bishop could create. For example, the knight was pinned, or an exchange would, without the queen here, if the queen was not on b6, that kind of exchange, if the pawn had to take back, would really expose my king. My queen goes to f6. The only good news for white is that there is no chance for a discovered check. But this really makes my life easier. When I saw it, that this exchange was going to take place, when his bishop took my knight, I felt some kind of relief. Knight is protected by the queen, but you don't want the queen to stay on c2 just to protect the knight, so knight goes back to d4 at the center of the board. My queen goes back to b6. At this point, there are two knights protecting the white king. One is Justin's on d4, and one is mine on c5. And Justin doesn't want to have to deal with this question. So king goes to h1. Now he is protected from the possibility of sudden discover check. And especially since now he doesn't have the dark colored bishop to put on f2. The problem is on h1, there could be the possibility of a back rank problem in the future. And when I say problem, not necessarily the mate itself, but maybe in order to avoid the mate, he may have to play a move that otherwise he wouldn't need to play. So he plays it now. Rook goes to b8, threatens the pawn on b2. Attack twice, defended once. It's defended with the rook going to a2. And my rook goes to e8 to occupy the open file. We finish the first 30 moves, and after the exchange of my knight for Justin's bishop, I start being ahead. I'm minus 1.21 means that black is ahead by 1.21. This is after the first 30 moves, but there is a long way ahead. So let's see what will happen. Knight goes to e2. And my rook goes to e5. Computer thinks that this is a big mistake. And let's see why it's a mistake. Because my queen will go to b3. Threaten the queen, threaten the rook. It would be very difficult to save the rook. My advantage would have been 5.41. What could the white do if the exchange, then my pawns are not double pawns and b pawns next to each other, could create danger, but I don't understand why. But in any case, that is what's called spilt milk. My rook goes to e5. Misses. The computer still ahead by 1.85. Well, the computer would like what? Now it has a different choice. Now after it wants queen goes to b3. Exchange, rook to a5. My rook goes to a2, rook to c5, and rook goes to b2. You see here the right part of the board. If I had played according to the computer, I would have a 4.71 advantage by going that way. Let's give a look. I would have two extra pawns, although one of them was going to get lost. And my a pawn would be passed. A, B are connected passed pawns. That is what I should have played, but instead my rook goes to e5, threatening to go to h5 and perhaps a check on h2 or who knows what. I still have an advantage, but instead of 4.71, I only have 1.85. Knight goes to g1 for white. And my rook goes to e8. By doing so, I have doubled my rooks on the e file. Queen goes to f2. Even though I missed the chance according to the computer, at least now I'm on the offensive, and I'm the one creating threats. I send my queen to b3. Look at what's happening. Before, the queen was defending the knight, and now the knight can easily be lost. But if the knight is lost, I'm attacking two rooks now, a2 and d1. That is why Justin is not going to take my knight. What will he play? Rook goes to a1. By doing so, the rooks protect each other, and I have now to start worrying about my knight. What is my knight going to do? Queen goes to b5. Why b5 and not b6? Because on b6 it would be the pin. Justin moves his pawn to f4 to attack my rook. And instead of defending my rook, knight goes to e4 and attacks a queen. Not only attacks a queen, if white takes my rook on e5, knight to f2 is what's called a smothered checkmate. That is why the queen goes to c2. My rook is still threatened. And my rook goes to h5. And it threatens mate in 1. Because if I could play again, knight goes to g3 is checkmate. But the computer says a good move. After I played it, I felt that if white does not fall for this, my rook is in a very bad shape, is in danger. How does white reply? Threatens my rook, and my rook has very few squares to go. Yes, the computer says that this is a mistake and my advantage 3.84, but I need to worry about my rook. Where can it go? Cannot go g5, f5, e5, it will be lost. Cannot go to h2, it cannot go to h3, only one square to go h4. Okay, yes, it goes now, but what in the future, for some reason, this square is also under attack. Great move, says the computer. I just felt at that time some relief. At least there's a square to go, but I felt that I really need to worry. Computer that can see many moves ahead could easily see that no matter what white does, black has a way to save the rook, but I couldn't see it at that time. Pawn goes to h3, protected by the knight, and my rook has really nowhere to go. h3, the knight. g4, the pawn. h5, the other pawn. And my rook is in a square that's has absolutely nowhere to go. If it is threatened by the knight, it will take the pawn. The queen cannot threaten because the knight will take the queen, but I'm barely saving the rook. That's what I felt at the time. What do I play? Queen goes to c5 to bring the queen near the game and exert more influence on the king. But while I was doing that, I was also feeling, be very careful about your rook on h4. No matter how good your position might seem, and not that, materially speaking, you only have one extra pawn. Be careful, because if you lose your rook, your good position is not going to save you. King goes to g2. King wants to go away, and also, if knight goes to f3, the rook is lost, because look at that. If white could play second move in a row and the knight goes to f3, the rook can go nowhere. It cannot go to h3 because the king will take it. Can white counterattack? Doesn't seem so. How to deal with this threat? Queen goes to e3. Why? Because if Knight goes to f3, then computers have even think that knight to f3 is a good move. Because if let's assume that knight goes to 3. Let's give a look at it. Rook takes, king takes, queen takes with a check. And although I lost a rook, lost a rook for a knight and a pawn, my attack is very strong. That's why the computer thinks it is the best. How does white reply? Threatens my queen by taking by sending a rook to d3. And my queen is going to take the pawn on f4, which brings some relief for the rook. Great moves the computer. We finished 40 moves. I'm ahead by 3.81 says the computer, but my rook is still in danger, but maybe a little bit less danger than before. Yes, it may still be lost, but for example, if the knight went to f3, my rook would be under attack, but the queen could go to g4 and check. We finish the first 40 moves as I mentioned, and the game goes on and has a long future in front of it. Rook goes to f3. Queen goes to e5 to defend my queen. And it is going to take back the pawn on a4. And what do I want to do now? I move my pawn to h5. Why do I do it? Because, and the computer says the best, because if I lose, first of all, the queen takes it back, but more or less my rook finally has more space to go. And at this time, it seems that Justin got a little bit panicked and decides to relieve his pressure by using his rook on a4 to take my knight on e4. Good is a computer. After the game, Justin would tell him he thought that this was his crucial mistake. I don't think this was a crucial mistake. It was not the best move, but personally, I think the big mistake is when he used his bishop to take my knight, and we exchanged many moves before. But let's see what's going to happen now. Pawn takes back the rook, and I really start having a significant material advantage. Rook goes to f5 to threaten my queen. My queen goes to e6. King goes to g3, and now, believe it or not, my rook has nowhere to go. This is the crucial moment because even if I have some small advantage, if I lose my rook on h4, things change dramatically. Look at the rook. If it goes to h3, it can be taken either by the king or the knight. If it goes to g4, it will be taken either by the pawn or by the king. There's nowhere else to go. And I only have one move to save me. And this is not going to save the rook, but it's going to save me. And this move is pawn goes to g4. And, and you may be wondering, isn't my rook still lost? Yes, but if it is lost, so is a white rook. That is why I said that this move saves me, but does not save the rook. Justin decides to take my other pawn and defend his rook on f5. But now my rook is free to go to h6. So finally, I save my rook. Not an easy endeavor, and was barely able to do it by, as I say, the skin of my teeth. Knight goes to h3, and queen goes to d6 with a check. From now on, you see that my advantage, in fact, even before that, my advantage was quite significant, but before that, it depended on me finding a way to save the rook, which was not easy at all. But now things are easier. You see, my advantage is 5.41. Knight goes to f4 to cover the check. If, for example, rook went here, knight will take my rook will take the knight, king takes back, and then I win the rook. That is why, where else can the king go? Not too many places. Each one has its own follow-up, so knight goes to f4. And my pawn goes down to e3. In addition to material advantage, now I have the possibility of promoting. Justin will stop it by placing his queen on e2. My rook goes to f6. At this point, I see that if I exchange material, I have a much better position. As they say, when you're ahead, exchange material. I don't want the rook on f5 to cause me problems. For example, go to d5 and threaten my queen. I send my rook to f6. And if black moves the rook, if white moves the rook, then the knight on f4 is lost. That is why Justin will exchange the rooks. I take back with g pawn, even though this makes my king less safe, because by doing so, the knight is still pinned. And there are few pieces to take advantage of the fact that the g file is open. My queen goes to e5. Where are we now? We finish move number 50. And after the 50 moves, my advantage is 4.56. We'll continue with move number 51. King goes to f3 to be near the pawn, to advance past pawn. My queen goes to e5 to give more protection to the pawn. If this pawn is lost, it is attacked twice by queen and king, defended twice by king and rook. If it's lost, I still have an advantage, but not so much, not so big, and not so easy to convert. Knight goes to h5. And here I need to be careful with what I play, because there is a potential of the knight going to f6 and forking rook and king. And if I'm not careful where I put my queen, if I, for example, I put on d5, expecting to go to d2 and exchange the queen and pawn promotion, then I can even lose my queen. That's why I need to be extremely careful of how I play. Currently, my queen on e5 is protecting the pawn on f6. And the queen doesn't have too many squares to go to continue protecting it. Yes, there are the d6 and d6, but that's it. d6, I'm not going to lose the pawn, but the pawn will be less protected. What did he say to do? Push my pawn to f5. White takes it, and I take it back with a check. And white is going to lose the knight unless they reply by having the knight on the f4 square. Not only that, queen cannot check. d5, h5, h3. If it checks, then the queen is lost, and that will take it. How do I play now? Rook goes to e4 and threatens the knight. And I'm in a place where the knight is pinned and cannot go anywhere. Yes, it's true that if I take with my rook, then the king can take the pawn, and of course the queen can go here and have a steward over the white queen. And in case if I can get the knight, I have an extra rook, so I don't even have to worry so much about promoting the pawn. And white defends the only way they could. And while he was thinking, I knew that this was the move to play. There was no other choice. Queen goes to g2. Computer thinks the second best move and would rather have lose the queen, take the pawn and lose to the rook. But I don't think so, because then my win is very easy. Well, now I really have to fight quite a lot. King goes to f8. Of course, you don't want the king to be on the h file. King goes to e2 to stop the pawn from being pushed. But now I'm taking the knight. My advantage becomes much larger because now I have an extra rook and an extra pawn. But Justin continued fighting because there is a chance of what is called a perpetual check. The queen goes to h1 to be able to deliver checks and who knows what. And I really need to be careful because if I make the mistake to move my rook to e7, it is mate in 1. And suddenly from being 10.2 ahead as you see here, I will have to concede defeat. But I saw it. And instead of putting my rook on e7, I put it on e8. So after the check, the rook threatens the queen. I was expecting queen go to h8, instead it goes to h5. With the possibility of a check on c5 or who knows what. My queen goes to f2, check. Computer thinks I have mate in 17 moves. Clearly, if king goes to d1, king has only 2 legal moves. If it goes to d1, it checkmate immediately, but as they say, surprise, surprise, white plays a king on d3. Queen checks on d2, king goes to d3. Sorry, king from d3 goes to c4. I now have to find a way to make my opponent before he starts checking me, and who knows, maybe end up in perpetual or winning some material or what. Rook goes to c8, check. And we finish the first 60 moves. We finish the first page of recording the moves. I'm still having a great position. 8.13 is my advantage. But I still need to fight until the end. Because Justin is going to fight all the way, see if he can have a perpetual or who knows what. King goes to b3. Rook goes to b8. King goes to a4. So at least the king is stuck in the edge of the board. Queen goes to d7, check. King goes to a3. King went to a5, then rook checks from here, and the white king is lost. And I'm so near the end. If I didn't have this pawn on a6, it would be checkmate. Queen goes to d6 to check. And white sends the bishop to b4. Defends with the bishop. Not the bishop, I'm sorry. The pawn from b2 goes to b4. And the pawn at c3 protects the pawn on b4, so my queen cannot take it and check. That's why my rook goes to e8 to protect the pawn on e3 that is very near promotion. Queen goes to h8. King goes to e7. Queen goes to h4, check. I defend with the f pawn. Queen goes to e4, check. And I'm going to lose my passed pawn unless there's only one move that saves it. And still I'll be ahead even if I lose it, but why deprive myself of this possibility? So queen goes to e6. And my pawn on e3 stays there. Queen goes to h7. King goes to d8. Queen checks on d3 now. Every move I play, I try to see how can I minimize the checks for my opponent. How can I see there a way to stop them or to force exchange of queens or something like that. King goes to c8. If queens are exchanged, I'm winning very easily. I have an extra rook and I have a pawn near promotion. Queen goes to e2 to block the pawn from continuing. And since this pawn cannot continue, let's try the other pawn. Goes to f5. We finish 70 moves. This is the number of moves that I had in the previous game. Now this game will go on a little longer. And let's see how it will finish. It's very difficult for white to win. They only had one chance before. If I was careless and placed my rook on e7 that I placed instead of e8, it doesn't seem that they can easily win, but they might be able to hold the game, hold the draw. Move 71. Queen goes to f3, hoping for a check from a8 or who knows what. My queen goes to e4 to stop any such ideas. If queens are exchanged, I win. My pawn is promoted. Queen goes to e2 again. My king goes to b7 because there was the possibility of check on a6. You don't want your opponent to start the checks, even if the computer feels they're harmless, but in real game, you don't know what may come out of that. Pawn goes to b5 for white. And my pawn go, there was a possibility of check from a6, but or if I took it, queen goes to b5, check and checks continue. To avoid that possibility, instead of taking the pawn, my pawn goes to a5. Queen goes to h5. And my pawn goes to e2. I'm near promotion, one square only, and not easy to stop. I don't think there's a way to stop the promotion unless the white queen sacrifices itself. If it goes to h1, pawn is promoted, and we exchange queens. But white is not giving up, even though the computer says we're 10 moves away from the end. Queen goes to f7 to check. Rook blocks it. Queen goes to g6. And now I'm promoting. I have a second queen. At this point, 8 moves away from the mate, says the computer. I have 2 queens, a rook, and a couple of pawns for a queen and a couple of pawns. But Justin is not going to give up. Check from a6. King to b8. I was afraid if king went to c7, the pawn would go to b6 with the check, and who knows, maybe the b pawn could be promoted. Queen goes to b6, and Justin might have been dreaming of back and forth a and b5, but I sent one of my queens to b7 to block the check. Queen goes to d8 now to check. King goes to a7. Queen wins a pawn, goes to a5 and wins my pawn. Queen goes to b8, king goes to b8. Also, if I'm not careful, there could be a 3-fold repetition. Queen goes to d8. Will it go back and forth? Queen goes to c8. Queen to b6. White checks again. Rook goes to b7. One more check from d6 for white. My queen goes to c7. And check from f8. My king goes to a7. And let's see what is the situation. We finished, believe it or not, 84 moves. Computer says I'm 5 moves away from 8. Any chance that white can have a check? If the pawn goes to b6, yes, but the pawn would be lost. It's not protected. If there was a pawn on c5, yes, that would have been tricky because it's a royal fork. The pawn could fork from b6. Any other one, the queen can check from a8 or from c5. These are the only two options, but in either case, the queen is lost. Stalemate is not easy because white has, in addition to the queen, two other pawns, so even if the queen is sacrificed, there is no stalemate anywhere. So at this point, after 84 moves, white, Justin resigned. Uh, Before we go to the analysis, congratulations to Justin because he played a very strong game. And even when it seemed to be completely hopeless, he would still find ways to continue and create issues for me. And I had to use all my energy and all my concentration until the very end for a game that went for about 4 hours. And thus I ended up with 4 out of 6 points, 4 wins and 2 losses. And especially now, I beat a player stronger than me because my other 3 wins were against players with lower ratings than mine. Before the final thoughts, let's review the game. Let's see what chess.com has to say about that. 83.3 accuracy for me, 80.4 for my opponent. And the ratings. I played as if my rating was 2200 and my opponent's 2000. Well, we both played well. I feel that because White's errors were quite small. And I think the crucial move that changed everything was when the bishop on the bishop took, let's see, which move was it? Move number 27, when the bishop from h4 took my knight on f6 and my queen took it back, because this changed the dynamic. But I'm very happy with myself. I was able to win that game, although I had to, not to say to suffer, to fight very hard for a very long amount of time. And you understand, when the game goes 4 hours, it's not so difficult for a player to lose concentration and to make the crucial mistake that changes everything. But let's see how do we do in the various details. Zero brilliant and zero great moves for either one of us. Best moves, 37 for me out of 84, meaning a little bit less than a half, and 35 for my opponent, for Justin. Excellent, 22 versus 18. Good moves, 11 for Justin, 7 for me. Book moves, the first 7 moves were book moves. And in the negatives, inaccuracies, 8 for Justin, 6 for me. Mistakes, 2 for Justin, 1 for me. 2 misses for each of us, and 1 blunder for me. This concludes the coverage of the New York State Championship, and let's have a look at my rating. How did the rating change? After my 4 wins and 2 losses, from 1582, my rating jumped 32 points up to 1614, which means that after about 4 or 5 years, finally, I crossed the 1600 mark. I was happy with my performance, and the 2 games that I lost, they are not dramatic loss. It's only that I missed some folks, and I completed my experience, my participation in the New York State Chess Championship. That's all I had to say for now. No need to share any longer. The next tournaments. Sunday, September 7th, I participated at the 82nd Chessanity tournament. I'm going to cover it in the next videos. And I already started participating in the Queen's Chess Club this September, October. They call it the Septober tournament. I already completed the first 2 rounds and there are 3 more rounds to go. We're going to show these games as they come. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have not subscribed, please consider clicking the subscribe button. Thank you for watching. Thanks for the likes. Thanks for the comments. I'm Harry Lausaneziris. This is my Greco Chess YouTube channel. Goodbye.